Good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning. Everybody up this morning? Everybody paying attention yet? I think that's good. For a long time, a lot of people were not paying attention to a great many things. So I thought we would have a little chat and tell you what I started to see, when I started to see it, and why I have been so obsessed with getting people to see it. Not that I would presume that my opinion matters much more than anyone else's. Why should it? I have no credentials. I'm just some raving lunatic in his car, right? Yeah, except I do pay attention to a lot of things. A little more than most people. And I was noticing back in the day, I was noticing the rise of radicalism. Because I was heavily involved in the Zeitgeist movement. Well, not heavily. I mean, I certainly talked a lot of smack on Facebook around the Zeitgeist movement, and I kind of bought into the whole capitalism is the problem type thing. And again, the problem is that people don't define their terms very well. What do we even mean when we say capitalism? For some people, it means one thing. For other people, it means something completely different. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, is that radicalism is what happens when you have wildly different definitions of reality. And that came to a head just a couple weeks ago. And I think I'm watching a lot of people's faces out there, especially moms, as I walk my kids to school most days. But especially moms. Moms they look stunned. And I don't blame them. Because I think the way that it's being portrayed out there, or at least the way a lot of people are seeing it, in the popular kind of like discourse, it's that one side is claiming the shooter of Charlie Kirk was radicalized by, we'll just call it trans culture. And the other side, and so we're going to get to that, but let's call it trans culture. One side, the normie kind of view on the news is that he was radicalized by trans culture. I'm not going to get into all of the details about the shooter. The whole thing is sus. Like, I'm not gonna say it's not. It is. It's totally sus. There's a lot of sus. It's extremely sus. The shooter itself, I'll post a video underneath this where a guy who's a body language expert noticed that there is two different versions of the actual sentencing going on with this guy, where he is extremely stoic and barely moves. And the guy, one of the points he makes is he says, this guy barely moves to acknowledge anything is happening. He's just like, when they're reading out the charges and the things that he's done, there's like almost zero emotional investment whatsoever. He's just staring, right? And even when people are doing that, there's reasons why they might do that, but he's just so emotionally cold that it's unsettling. And the guy points that out. He says, like, man, this guy is like not showing anything, because normally there'll be subtle body movements or whatever, little nods. But what this guy caught was that there is one little nod in the explaining of this guy's charges to him, and depending on where you got the feed of that particular reading, there's a lag in the sound, where at one point where he nods because they're talking about trans ideology, and he says, you did this because of the trans whatever, and he nods. And then there's one where it's like they finish hearing the charges and he nods, and just that tiny little lag changes where the emphasis on his acknowledgement of something is, right? If he's either acknowledging that he did it because this was an attack on trans culture, or he's acknowledging that he understands the charges as they've been read to him. There's a subtle difference. I'll post it underneath. You can watch it. The point being that I'm not going to get into all of that. I want to talk about the rise of the meta-narrative, okay? The difference between what I would argue is progressive ideas, okay? Progressive culture, this idea that we're always moving on into something else, we're always becoming something else, we're always moving away from the past and becoming something else. And this idea that, no, some things were good in the past and we don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as it were. The rise of radicalism is something I noticed, like, immediately, because I was just looking at psychology. I was trying to understand the difference between capitalism and communism and what kind of, like, inspired those ideas. So I was getting really into that kind of stuff back when I was into the Zeitgeist movement. And so this is pre-Donald Trump getting elected. And when Donald Trump first came down the escalator and announced that he was going to run for president, I was like, I scoffed like most people. I was like, what? This guy? Like, you got to be kidding me. He's a TV star guy. What do you call those? A reality show star. I'm like, this guy? There's a lot of problems right now, but not this guy. He's like a clown. And it was only after I listened to a few of his speeches and I recognized that what he was actually saying was that there's a rise of these kind of radical elements of society. And you can call them, by the way, when I say this, I'm talking in meta-narratives. I'm not talking about any individual person. Okay, that's very important. I'm not talking about any individual person. I'm talking about ideas. Because people act out what they believe. And when somebody really believes something, it kind of changes how they are even able to interpret and thereby communicate what it is they're saying. So there was a rise in what appeared to be radical Islam in the Middle East with, obviously Al-Qaeda was the first, and then it was ISIS, I think, was running around. Don't try to nail me on the timelines. I'm just pointing out that there was a rise in radical Islam and what perceived rise in radical Islamic attacks in Europe, things like that. I'm not saying anything about Islam as a whole other than people who believe it, I believe, are just like anybody else, and that's the culture they grew up with, and they are good people. I believe most people are decent, but I believe we are born in a world that is just riddled with sin. Because I am a Christian, I decided I'm a Christian, and so that's how I try to understand things. But you need to understand too that being a Christian is to radically accept all forms of truth except that which says a handful of things. Forgiveness is paramount. You cannot judge. There is only one God. There is only one way to the truth, and that way to the truth is Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ was a radical for his time. You need to understand he was a radical among many radicals, but he was a radical in that he completely changed the way that everybody understood how we should think about human rights. And we should understand that everybody was born imago Dei, born in the image of God, made in the image of God. Okay? But what did that mean? That translated into saying that every single person has a spark of the divine, every single person has a soul. And that soul is not simply the byproduct of their genes or their, like, the physical body. Your soul is something different and apart from your soul. It is something that is gifted to you by God that makes you different than all the other animals on the earth. There is the creation, which is where we occupy. which a lot of people now are starting to say, oh, we live in a simulation, this kind of stuff. That's, I think, that's probably, like, that is the right way to think about it for me to understand what I'm trying to say to you. We live in this world, but we are not necessarily bound to it. We have a spiritual dimension. We have a soul. And I believe that soul is a gift from God. And I believe that the God that came here on this earth to tell us that and make it explicit and said you're not allowed to enslave other people because of what you believe, you need to say, I am not the God of other people. I can't determine what the worth of another person is with my ideas unless... Yeah, go ahead, buddy. Rush. Unless you think about this first. You must let he who is without sin cast the first stone. That's really important. And I saw people flipping out over the things that he was saying. He was saying there's a rise in radical Islam, there's a rise in radical gender ideology, there's a rise in leftist ideas. The leftist ideas, progressive ideas, are shrugging off. They're shrugging off of what was previous. Think about what was Kamala Harris always saying? Oh shoot! You know what? Somebody else write it. If it comes to me, I'll tell you later. But it was something like being unburdened by what has been, or something like that. But that was pure Marxism. The idea is that you're escaping the bounds of reality, and you're creating your own version of reality. You are becoming your own God, a person without gods above you that would determine what is right and what is wrong. We, as humanity, determine what is right and what is wrong. That is basic progressivism. Because we are much smarter than the last generation. We are more educated. We are obviously progressive. We are going to evolve. We're an evolving species. We were Cro-Magnon before, and now we are evolving into something new. That goes into posthumanism, that goes into transhumanism, that goes into trans. Trans translates into transhumanism. But it starts with trans. There's a book written by Martine Rothblatt, a billionaire, the inventor of a bunch of technologies, but I think she still owns Sirius. I might lose you here because I might lose a signal. I'm kind of driving through a back street. If I do, that will suck. So hopefully it holds out. But Martine Rothblatt, who was born a male and is trans into female, wrote a book called From Transgender to Transhuman. Because that's the trajectory of progressive ideas. You're escaping the material reality of this world and you're becoming something else. You're basically escaping the soul that exists, and you're becoming one with the material. That's what the bio-digital convergence is. The point is that all of these things come from this idea that we're escaping something. We must be oppressed, so we are escaping to something else. And the rise of this radical idea that was countervalent to the radical ideas of Jesus that created the modern world, that, led to actual equality, fairness, justice, replaced by social justice, which is this idea that society itself is the problem. And I wrote a whole piece talking about the difference between the French Enlightenment and the American Enlightenment. And the American Enlightenment was born of a different set of ideals. There's two different versions of it. But one basically was rooted in, it rooted in Anglo-Protestantism, not Judeo-Christian. Okay, Protestants were like throwing off the monarchy, throwing off feudalism. They believed that they could have a personal relationship with God And it came largely from Puritan types in England that were trying to get away from the king because the king had become cruel and unusual towards the people and said, oh, no, I have the power of God. So the king adopted this idea that he had the power of God. And the church held that up. The point is that Protestants said, no, we can figure out our own thing. And in the case of the French Revolution, that became what I would argue is the beginning of progressive ideals, which is free from all gods, free from all establishment, free from all religion, free from everything. They are going to make their own version of reality, and they killed just as many people as they needed to do that whenever they felt like somebody was standing in the way of their radical freedom ideas. They would kill those people with the guillotine. Right? You guys all know about this, right? But in the American version, they were not trying to free themselves from, they were not trying to unburden themselves from what had been. They were trying to say, no, I'm just throwing off these false representatives of God on earth. I will develop a relationship with God myself on earth. And that relationship with God fostered a completely different environment where, yes, there was a lot of radical ideas, but it was based on this idea that God wanted people to be free. And that also ended up going back and kind of like infecting the British sentiment, and eventually the British freed the slaves, ended the slave trade. But that was based out of ideas out of the American Revolution, not the French Revolution. Anyway, I wrote this piece kind of describing that because there's so many people I am seeing on the progressive left defending actual violence, like an actual assassination of a person who was preaching forgiveness, a relationship with the truth, a relationship with real things, as opposed to this idea that you're going to escape all the things and create your own reality. And I'm not saying anything about trans, like I don't want to blame the trans thing. I don't blame people for being lost and confused. I do not. It is not my place to blame. I don't know what's in their souls. Because I'm not God. There was only one God, and that God told us that the world is something that you can make sense of. And told us the best way to live our lives, and that produced the most prosperity ever known in the world. But because those kind of ideals have been attacked relentlessly, now we're watching people, like if you watch Piers Morgan program, people on the left that are defending this assassination, and they're saying, well, I'm not defending it, but Charlie said a lot of mean things. No, he challenged people on their convictions, and he said, why don't you put your convictions on the test against mine? And they always lost because they never really had anything real to cling on to. There was nothing there. It was all just about escaping. They were escaping responsibility. And we have a society now where it's all about escaping responsibility. It's about escaping blame. It's about escaping, all the blame has to be put on what is, so that it can be torn down to replace it with something that they cannot even define. And that's what Charlie Kirk really represented. Charlie Kirk represented this idea that you can define things. You can make sense of things. And I bring this all back because I'm going to go in and get my eggs now, but I'm seeing a lot of moms looking very puzzled because while they supported this idea of trans and there's trans flags all over the place now, that's really a radical idea. It's a radical idea pretending to be a nice idea. It's an ideology, and people act out what they believe. So it is a religious presupposition, and it is a religious presupposition that goes against another religious presupposition that says that no, there is actually an ordered and right way to live your life. And that idea was constantly engaged in a battle of words, and you could see people getting more and more radicalized. And it's like, now these moms are realizing, wait a second, do you mean that if I simply want to have a normal life for my children, that I can be a target of violence by these people because I'm not radical enough? That's a threat. You do realize that's a threat. I think people are starting to realize there's a threat from people that tell you that they need to be free of all things. And it's the same threat that happened in the French Revolution. And what I'm telling you is that what the sentiment we see rising is the same thing as the French Revolution. That's what it sounds like. That's what it looks like. That's what it is. And I wrote a whole Substack trying to explain the differences between radicalism and a radicalism of acceptance of responsibility for society. Okay, I hope that makes sense. The people that are saying that this stuff is okay, that violence is supported by violent words, like you've seen hate speech is like free speech is not hate speech. Well, there is a classification of free speech that should be rightfully spoken down towards, but let people have their radical ideas, let free speech live, and then you can figure out which ideas are better. But if somebody incites to violence, that's where you draw the line. But if somebody simply says, well, how do you know you're right? And then asks you to debate it, you can't meet that with violence because you don't like the way that they're making you feel. It's not about feelings. It's about what is true. What is your relationship to the truth? Hey, good morning, Bobby. Okay, I hope that makes some kind of sense. I love you guys. God bless. Should I do the thing? You are a human soul having an experience. You're meeting right at the intersection of the material and the metaphysical, and it's getting pretty wild out here. So welcome to the singularity. Some things are happening, but you're being asked to make a choice. What do you believe? And it's real, and it's palpable, and it's happening right now. Okay, I love you guys. Jesus walks.